The Chicano movements, specifically the East LA school walkouts, were a result of the social and political climate of the 1960s. For years prior to the blowouts, militant Chicano activists had waged a campaign to end discrimination against Mexicans living in the U.S. Nationally, this campaign was composed of several smaller struggles addressing issues such as farm workers' rights, land tenure, educational reform, political representation, the war in Vietnam, and police brutality. Seen together, these efforts became known as the Chicano movement. Consisting primarily of young people frustrated with the slow pace of traditional reform, the movement developed a nationalist concept of Chicanismo, signaling that they were rejecting assimilation into the American culture. The single most important factor that contributed to the organization of the blowouts was the terrible circumstance of the educational system forced upon Mexican-American students. For years, the Mexican-American community in East LA was unsuccessful in their calls for change and attempts to improve the education system through appropriate channels. East LA high schools had a push-out rate of over 50%, leaving them with a deplorable record and the lowest reading scores in the district. In such schools, classrooms were overcrowded and taught by teachers who lacked the sensitivity for and understanding of the Mexican working-class families whom they taught. Further, in the 1960s, Mexican Americans were reportedly the nation's second largest and fastest growing minority group. At the mercy of established institutional racism, this group was restricted to the lowest paying, most menial jobs and endured discrimination, including segregation in education, housing, and public spaces. In early March, years of frustration exploded in LA schools and spilled onto the streets. The walkout started on Friday, March 1, 1968, when students prematurely walked out of Wilson High School. Although some students returned to class when police arrived and demanded so, most refused. By Monday morning, over 2,000 students marched out of Garfield High School to the activists shouting, "Blowout" in the hallways, recruiting more students to walk out. In the days that followed, the strike spread to 6 more high schools in Los Angeles. The student organizers of the blowouts presented a list of demands to the Board of Education. The list demanded smaller class sizes, compulsory bilingual and bicultural education, more emphasis on Chicano history, more teacher involvement with the students, and more community involvement within the school. In just 1 week, over 10,000 students had participated in the blowouts. Identifying this threat, the LAPD organized their own campaign to destroy the efforts and the Chicano movement. Their campaign used coercive force to harass, intimidate, and, when possible, to arrest and persecute Chicano activists in brown berets, attempting to suppress Chicano protests through violence. An article in the Los Angeles Times captured the sentiments of the board in response to the list of demands, stating that school officials deny any prejudice in allocation of building funds and say that they agree with 99% of the students' demands, but that the district does not have the money to finance the kind of massive changes proposed. Unsatisfied with the board's lack of action on these demands, many students walked out again, moving their demonstrations onto board meetings. Although the walkouts themselves only lasted a couple weeks, the community was alive with the issue of school reform. On June 2, 1968, despite the board's assertion that students would be given amnesty, 13 organizers involved in the blowouts were arrested and held on conspiracy charges for planning the walkouts. As the summer passed, the struggle with the LAUSD intensified, especially after the transfer of Sal Castro, a Chicano high school teacher at Lincoln. Students protesting Castro's removal led efforts to reinstate him, resulting in a nearly 2-month sit-in at the LAUSD headquarters. Chicano writers acknowledged that the blowouts and their immediate aftermath were a defining moment in Chicano student politics. Students and the East LA community transformed the immediate struggle for educational rights into practices that disrupted the dominant narrative and developed a second order based on self-determination and participatory democracy. The blowouts clearly went beyond the plans and participation of students and activists. They began as a movement for educational reform that quickly challenged the institution, transforming Chicano political behavior into a more participatory democracy.